Welcome once again to our series, Ancient Laws for Modern Living, walking through the Ten Commandments. One day, I was excited to bring my wife a gift. I had purchased her a plant at the store, which I thought that she would like, and I brought it home. I said, "Guess what? I have a surprise for you." And when I showed her the plant, she said, "Oh, thank you." She was not very impressed. In her mind, instead of looking at the plant as a gift, she really just looked at it as something that she had to take care of. Anyways, it really was my mistake. And the point is that love must be given in a proper manner. Likewise, worship must be done, if it is appropriate and if it is proper, in the right way. Worship must be done according to God's standards, not ours. And in order to worship the Creator as we ought, we must worship Him as He desires. But there's a problem. Humans, we, are prone to worship God in our own way rather than the way that God prescribes. Churches can be so focused on experience, the fog machines, the flashy lights, that they forget about doctrine and truth and in spirit. But let's not talk maybe about other people. Let's talk about us. When we sing before God at church, do our hearts drift? When we read the Bible, do we really read thankfully and receptively? When we pray, do we do it with all of our heart and all of our focus? When we serve, are we doing it as to the Lord? In the second commandment, we find that God calls Israel to worship Him properly because of His jealousy for His name. Last week, we looked at the fact that we are to worship God alone. But after giving this directive, God calls Israel not only to worship Him alone, but to worship Him as He prescribes. And so what we're going to see today is that because of God's jealousy, we must worship Him as He prescribes. And I want to turn your attention to these two truths. How do we worship God? And why do we worship God? So let's address that first question. How do we worship God? Well, first, the second commandment tells us that we are to worship God as He prescribes. Exodus 20 verse 4 says this, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." Israel was commanded not to make images of God. These carved images were often made by the ancient civilizations to represent the place where God dwelt. Now, many of you might be thinking, why would people worship an object? Well, that's not really what they thought the object was. The object to these people was a representation of the deity that was outside. And what they would do is they would often come and they would clothe the deity, they would take care of the deity, they would bring stuff to it, and they would show worship to their spiritual God by making an image of that God. But Israel was not commanded to worship or serve them. The text says, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them or serve them." They were not to make an image of Yahweh. They weren't commanded to feed or clothe or offer sacrifices to any image of God. Now, how do we know that this commandment is referring to an image of God? Couldn't it just be referring to not worshiping any false gods? Well, that could be the case. It very well could be the case that this commandment is referring to not making any idols. But here's a few reasons why I think it's referring to not making an image of Yahweh Himself. First, in the context, it would seem a little bit redundant. It seems redundant to say that in the first commandment, you're not to worship anyone else but God. And in the second commandment, it would say the same thing. Next, in the book of Exodus, chapter 32, what we see is that Aaron makes a golden calf. And that golden calf is said to represent Elohim, which is plural in the Hebrew text. Now, some people take this to mean that Aaron was calling the people to worship the gods that took Israel out of Egypt. But it seems in that situation, Aaron actually made that golden calf for Yahweh Himself. And then finally, this command in Deuteronomy 4, verses 15 through 18, is based off the fact that there was no image of God on Mount Sinai. So each of these factors make me think that this second commandment is really referring to not making an image of Yahweh Himself. Why is it such a bad thing to do that? Well, there's a few reasons. First, we cannot shape or make God into our image. We can't place him in a certain location or make him fit our expectations. We can't manipulate him. As C.S. Lewis says about Aslan, he's not a tame lion. He is not one that we control. He is good, but he is not one that we can make into our own image. God cannot be made to look like his creation. But also, Christ is the only true image of God. In Colossians 1:15, it says that Christ is the image of the invisible God. Or Hebrews 1:3 says that Christ is the radiance of God's glory, the exact imprint of his nature. So we must worship God as he prescribes. As a side note, some people take this passage and say we should never make religious art, especially referring to God. We should never paint a picture of God. We should never paint a picture of Jesus. This gets into the realm of biblical opinion, and people differ. My personal opinion is that as long as you are not making an image of God or an image of Christ for the purpose of worship, then it is okay. That's my opinion. Christians differ, but it seems like this text is prohibiting the use of religious icons and images, like the Catholic Church does, for the purpose of worship. But anyway, how does God prescribe worship for New Testament believers? If we're going to say that we have to worship God properly, what does that look like? Well, John 4:4 says we are to worship God in spirit and in truth. Our attitudes are to be heartfelt, and we are to worship him according to doctrine. We're not to worship in a worldly way. Our worship is not to be sensual. It's not to reflect a lot of the sinful things in the world. It's to be God exalting. And we do this, Colossians says, to exhort one another. That's why we are to sing songs that are doctrinally sound to build others up. We also preach and pray and do communion as part of our worship because it's prescribed for us in Scripture. We also worship through Christ. You know, the unsaved world is not able to worship God because they do not have Christ. So we must worship God as he prescribes, in spirit and in truth, separated from the world with all of our hearts through Jesus Christ, through the means which he provides, through singing, through preaching, through prayer, through communion, through serving. Yet, God also gives us a reason why we are to worship him as he prescribes. We must worship him because of his jealousy. Exodus 20, halfway through verse 5, says this, "For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation, of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments." And here God gives the reason why Israel was not to worship idols. He says, "I am Yahweh. I brought you out of Egypt. I am a jealous God." He says that he's jealous for his name. He wants to be worshipped alone. And he says that he's jealous for his people. He wants his people to worship him alone. One author says that the opposite of this holy jealousy is indifference. To call God jealous, or for God to refer to himself as jealous, is simply to say that he does not ignore or take lightly, or is not indifferent about his bride going after another. God desires, above all else, that we as his people worship him properly. And also, he will pursue us and bring us back to him when we fail to worship him as we ought. Now, a question arises, why is God so concerned about himself? Doesn't this just make God an egomaniac? No, and here's why. Number one, God created all things. All of life is about God. All that exists for God. Second, what else would you put in God's place? A man? Part of creation? God is the only one that actually deserves this type of worship. And then finally, God is the most glorious thing. In fact, it wouldn't be like God, or it wouldn't be God-like, for God to go and want to worship something else, or want us to worship something else. So we are to worship God alone. And there's two ways his jealousy is expressed. Verse 5 says that God's jealousy is expressed in his punishment. It says that he visits the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation that hate me. Now, this isn't saying that if your parents sinned, you're stuck. The idea is that if a father was a sinner, God would come and bring punishment to them. And if his son carried on that same attitude, God would still punish sinners. This really isn't talking about a sin here and a sin there, but it's a lifestyle living against God. That phrase, "to those who hate me," really implies a people that are living against God. God punishes sin. He hates improper worship. We see this in Exodus in the golden calf incident. God kills 2,000 people because they, with a high hand, hated God by despising the way that he instructed them to worship. How might we improperly worship today? Well, if we come to worship and there's still sin between us and another Christian, the book of Matthew says that that's sin. If we worship just with our lips and with our deeds while we mistreat somebody, James says we can't bless God but curse men. Or if worship that is focused on ourselves, if it's only focused on the experience that I can get, it's really not about God. Or worship that is just to fulfill our desires, to make us feel good, that is not proper worship. Again, it's not that we come to God perfect. In fact, in James 4, God says that he draws near to those who are humble and are broken, and part of our worship should be confession of sin. But if we come to God with an attitude that we can just flippantly live in sin Monday through Saturday, and then on Sunday honor God with our devotion, that is the type of attitude God hates. But God's jealousy is also expressed in his love, in his loving kindness. It says that God shows mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Just like he visits with punishment on people who hate him, so he visits generations of people who love him with loving kindness. And we see this loving kindness in the book of Exodus. We see it expressed in God's forgiveness to Israel in Exodus 34. We see it expressed in the Exodus, where God takes the people out. Or even in the book of Genesis, God shows favor to Joseph. God shows overwhelming favor to those of us who are his children. I've emphasized so much that God saved us to be kind to us, and it's true. God sent Christ and brought us redemption to be kind to us. So because of this, what does a proper worship look like? Well, it looks like thankfulness. It looks like when we sing and when we read our scripture, when we pray, that we are thankful to God for all that we have done, for all that he has done. It looks like a humbleness, a brokenness over sin. It looks like confession in a contrite heart. And it looks like a weightiness or a fear of God, not having a wandering mind, not approaching God flippantly, but praising God for who he is. So because of God's jealousy, we must worship him as he prescribes. God is jealous. He wants his name to be magnified among all people. He is jealous in that he hates and punishes sin. And he is jealous that we as his people who have experienced love worship him in the manner which he prescribes. We are not at liberty to worship God as we please, but we are to worship him as he prescribes, because he is a jealous God. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to doing this study with you again next Tuesday.